While American forces were getting crushed across the Pacific, one general was winning every single battle. The Japanese thought he was reading their minds. Turns out, he was reading something even better. The Pacific War. Japan has conquered half of Asia in just 6 months. American forces are retreating everywhere. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, all fallen. The Japanese military seems unstoppable. But in the Southwest Pacific, there's one American general who hasn't lost a single major battle. His name is Douglas MacArthur. And the reason he keeps winning has nothing to do with luck. It's because of the most brilliant intelligence operation of the entire war. This is the story of how perfect planning and code-breaking turned the tide against Japan. To understand what MacArthur achieved, you need to understand just how bad things were for America in early 1942. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack destroyed much of America's Pacific Fleet. Battleships sunk. Planes destroyed on the ground. Thousands of American sailors dead. It was the worst naval defeat in American history. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. Over the next 6 months, Japan launched a massive offensive across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asia. They had a plan, and they executed it perfectly. Hong Kong fell to the Japanese on Christmas Day, 1941. The British garrison surrendered after weeks of fighting. Then Singapore, Britain's strongest fortress in Asia, fell in February 1942. Over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops surrendered. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, fell next. The oil fields that Japan desperately needed were now in Japanese hands. Burma fell, cutting off the Burma Road that supplied China. Malaya fell. Thailand fell. The Japanese were rolling through Asia like a tsunami. And then there were the Philippines, America's main military base in the Western Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur was in command there. He had about 130,000 troops, a mix of American soldiers and Filipino forces. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines in December 1941, MacArthur's forces fought back hard. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. Japanese air attacks destroyed MacArthur's planes on the ground, just like at Pearl Harbor. Japanese troops landed on the main island of Luzon and pushed inland. MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, a defensive position where they could hold out. Washington realized the Philippines couldn't be saved. There was no way to send reinforcements. The Pacific Fleet was wrecked. Japan controlled the seas. So President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia. MacArthur didn't want to leave his men, but orders were orders. In March 1942, MacArthur left the Philippines on a PT boat, escaping through Japanese naval patrols in a daring night run. When he reached Australia, he made his famous promise, "I shall return." The troops MacArthur left behind fought on for another month before surrendering. The Bataan Death March followed, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from Japanese brutality. It was a dark chapter in American military history. So by April 1942, MacArthur had arrived in Australia. He'd been appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. That sounds impressive, but the reality was grim. MacArthur had almost nothing to work with. The forces available in Australia were tiny. A few Australian divisions, some American units that had been sent as reinforcements. Maybe 25,000 combat troops total. That was it. No Navy to speak of. The Air Force had a handful of planes, mostly old models. Supplies were limited. Equipment was outdated. And facing MacArthur was the entire Japanese military machine. Over 1 million soldiers. The best Navy in the Pacific. Experienced troops who'd been fighting in China for years. They had momentum. They had confidence. They were winning everywhere. Japanese commanders expected to capture Australia next. They'd already seized New Guinea, the large island just north of Australia. From there, they could launch an invasion of Australia itself. The conquest of the entire Southwest Pacific seemed inevitable. But MacArthur wasn't planning to defend. He was planning to attack. Everyone thought he was crazy. See, MacArthur was different from other American generals. He was 62 years old in 1942. He'd been a general in World War I. He'd been Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s. He had more combat experience and strategic knowledge than almost anyone in the American military. But MacArthur also had a massive ego. He believed he was destined for greatness. He kept a personal photographer to document his every move. He wrote his own press releases. He was obsessed with his image and his legacy. Other generals found him difficult to work with. He was arrogant, vain, and he refused to admit mistakes. But MacArthur had one quality that made up for all his flaws. He understood how to plan military operations better than almost anyone alive. He thought in terms of campaigns, not just battles. He saw the big picture. And most importantly, he understood something that many generals didn't. Information wins wars. When MacArthur arrived in Australia, one of the first things he did was meet with his intelligence staff. He wanted to know everything about Japanese forces, their positions, their strength, their supply lines, their plans. What MacArthur discovered changed everything. Exploration/development. The intelligence staff briefed MacArthur on a secret operation that had been running since before the war started. American codebreakers had been working on cracking Japanese military codes. And in one of the greatest intelligence achievements in history, they'd succeeded. The operation was called Magic. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. They could read secret messages between Tokyo and Japanese embassies around the world. This had actually given Washington warning that Japan was planning to attack somewhere in late 1941, though the warning wasn't specific enough to prevent Pearl Harbor. But there was another code-breaking operation that was even more important. It was focused on Japanese naval codes. The operation was based in Hawaii and Australia. Teams of cryptographers worked around the clock trying to decrypt Japanese military communications. By early 1942, they were having success. Not complete success. They couldn't read everything, but they could read enough. They could identify Japanese ship movements. They could track Japanese naval units. They could sometimes figure out Japanese operational plans. MacArthur realized immediately that this was the key to everything. If he knew what the Japanese were planning before they did it, he could position his forces to counter them. He could avoid Japanese strengths and attack Japanese weaknesses. He could fight smarter instead of harder. So MacArthur made intelligence the foundation of his entire strategy. He demanded daily briefings from the codebreakers. He wanted to know every scrap of information they extracted from Japanese communications. He built his planning around what the intelligence told him. Other generals were skeptical of intelligence. They thought it was unreliable. They preferred to rely on their own judgment and experience. MacArthur was different. He trusted the intelligence, and he used it aggressively. The first major test came in May 1942. The codebreakers intercepted Japanese messages about a major operation. The Japanese were planning to capture Port Moresby, a strategic town on the southern coast of New Guinea. If Japan took Port Moresby, they'd have a base within bombing range of Australia. It would be a disaster. The Japanese plan was to send a large naval force, including aircraft carriers, to support an amphibious landing at Port Moresby. It was a major operation. If it succeeded, Australia would be in serious danger. But because the Americans had broken the Japanese codes, they knew the operation was coming. The U.S. Navy positioned carriers to intercept the Japanese fleet. The result was the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The battle was tactically a draw. Both sides lost ships. But strategically, it was an American victory. The Japanese called off the Port Moresby invasion. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, a Japanese offensive had been stopped. And it was stopped because American intelligence knew it was coming. MacArthur was paying close attention. He saw how intelligence had enabled the Navy to win at Coral Sea. He wanted to use the same approach for his ground operations. In June 1942, the Codebreakers provided intelligence that led to the Battle of Midway. Again, because the Americans knew Japanese plans in advance, they positioned their forces perfectly. The U.S. Navy destroyed 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. It was a crushing defeat for Japan. The tide of the Pacific War was starting to turn. MacArthur studied these battles carefully. He learned from them. He understood that the key was using intelligence to position forces before the battle started. Don't react to enemy moves. Anticipate them. Be there first. Fight on your terms, not theirs. So when MacArthur started planning his campaign to recapture New Guinea, intelligence was at the center of everything. New Guinea is a massive island. It's covered in jungle and mountains. The terrain is some of the worst in the world for military operations. Steep ridges, dense rainforest, swamps. Diseases like malaria and dengue fever were everywhere. It was a nightmare environment. The Japanese held the northern coast of New Guinea. MacArthur's forces held the southern coast. Between them was hundreds of miles of jungle and mountains. The Japanese had tried to cross these mountains to attack Port Moresby by land, but Australian troops had stopped them on the Kokoda track after brutal fighting. Now MacArthur wanted to go on the offensive. He wanted to push the Japanese back and recapture the northern coast of New Guinea. But doing this required careful planning. He didn't have enough troops to attack everywhere. He needed to pick his targets carefully. This is where MacArthur's genius showed. He developed a strategy called leapfrogging or island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese position, MacArthur would bypass strong Japanese bases and attack weaker positions. He'd capture strategic locations, build airfields, and use those airfields to support the next attack. Japanese bases that got bypassed would be cut off from supplies and reinforcements. They'd be isolated and useless. Eventually, they'd wither and die without ever being directly attacked. It was brilliant. It saved American lives, and it moved faster than traditional approaches. But leapfrogging only works if you know where the enemy is and how strong they are. That's where intelligence came in. MacArthur's codebreakers could tell him which Japanese bases were heavily defended and which were weak. They could identify supply routes. They could track Japanese ship movements. MacArthur used this information to plan every operation. He'd study the intelligence reports. He'd look at maps. He'd consult with his staff. And then he'd pick his target. Not the obvious target. Not the strongest target. But the target that made strategic sense based on what the intelligence told him. The first major operation was the capture of Buna and Gunna on the northern coast of New Guinea in late 1942. The intelligence indicated these positions weren't as heavily defended as other Japanese bases. MacArthur ordered an attack. The fighting was brutal. The jungle terrain made everything difficult. Japanese bunkers were well camouflaged and hard to destroy. American and Australian troops suffered heavy casualties. But they took Buna and Gunna by January 1943. MacArthur learned from this operation. He realized that even with good intelligence, jungle fighting was incredibly difficult. He needed better tactics, better training, better equipment. So he made changes. He brought in specialized units. He improved coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. He studied what worked and what didn't. And he continued to lean heavily on intelligence. Before every operation, MacArthur demanded detailed intelligence briefings. Where were the Japanese forces? How many troops did they have? What kind of fortifications? What were their supply lines? What reinforcements could they receive? The codebreakers worked around the clock to provide answers. They intercepted Japanese radio communications. They tracked Japanese ships. They identified Japanese unit movements. They built up a detailed picture of Japanese dispositions across the entire Southwest Pacific. MacArthur took this information and planned accordingly. In 1943, he launched a series of operations along the northern coast of New Guinea. Salamaua, La, Finschhafen, Madong. Each operation was carefully planned based on intelligence. MacArthur would identify a weak point in Japanese defenses. He'd land troops there, often using amphibious assaults combined with airborne drops. He'd bypass Japanese strong points. He'd cut Japanese supply lines. And because he knew where Japanese reinforcements were and when they'd arrive, he could position his forces to block them. The Japanese were completely confused. How did MacArthur always seem to know their plans? How did American forces keep showing up in unexpected places? How were they avoiding Japanese strong points and hitting weak points? Japanese commanders started to suspect there was a spy in their organization. They launched investigations. They changed codes and procedures. But it didn't help because the Americans were reading their communications. One of the most brilliant examples of MacArthur's planning was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943. Intelligence intercepts revealed that the Japanese were sending a convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers to reinforce their garrison at La on the northern New Guinea coast. The convoy was carrying about 7,000 troops and supplies. MacArthur's Air Force commander, General George Kenney, had been developing new tactics for attacking ships. Skip bombing, where planes would fly low and skip bombs across the water into the sides of ships. Kenney was eager to try these tactics on a real target. MacArthur gave him the Japanese convoy. Based on the intelligence, MacArthur knew exactly when and where the convoy would be. Kenney positioned his planes accordingly. On March 2nd and 3rd, American and Australian planes attacked the Japanese convoy. The results were devastating. All 8 transports were sunk. 4 destroyers were sunk. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers drowned. It was one of the most complete naval victories of the war, and it was achieved by air power alone. The Japanese were shocked. They'd thought the convoy route was safe. They had no idea American planes would be waiting for them. The loss of 7,000 troops and all that equipment was a major blow. And it happened because MacArthur's intelligence told him exactly where the convoy would be. He positioned his forces. He set the trap, and the Japanese walked right into it. MacArthur continued this approach throughout 1943 and 1944, operation after operation, always using intelligence to plan, always staying one step ahead of the Japanese, always attacking where the Japanese didn't expect. In February 1944, MacArthur pulled off one of his most daring moves. Intelligence indicated that the Admiralty Islands, far to the north of New Guinea, were lightly defended. The Japanese had a major base there, but most of their forces had been pulled back to defend other positions. MacArthur decided to attack the Admiralty Islands even though they were hundreds of miles from his nearest bases. It was a huge leap, bypassing numerous Japanese positions. If the intelligence was wrong, if the islands were heavily defended, the attacking force would be destroyed. MacArthur went with the operation anyway. He personally accompanied the first wave of troops, which was unusual and risky for a supreme commander. But MacArthur wanted to see the situation firsthand. He wanted to make decisions on the spot if needed. The landing on Los Negros Island in the Admiralties was touch and go. There were more Japanese troops than expected. The fighting was intense. For a while, it looked like the operation might fail. But MacArthur reinforced quickly. He brought in more troops. He provided air and naval support. And after several days of brutal fighting, the Americans secured the island. The capture of the Admiralty Islands was a turning point. It gave MacArthur a major forward base. It cut off thousands of Japanese troops in bypass positions. It moved the war hundreds of miles closer to the Philippines. And it showed the power of aggressive action based on good intelligence. Throughout all of these operations, MacArthur was also managing the political side of war. He dealt with the Australian government. He coordinated with the Navy, even though he and the Navy commanders often disagreed. He handled press relations, always making sure that newspapers reported his successes. He fought for resources, arguing that his theater deserved more troops and supplies. MacArthur was a master at all of this. He was a politician as much as a general. He knew how to work the system. He knew how to get what he needed, and he used those skills to build up his forces and capabilities. By mid-1944, MacArthur had over 500,000 troops under his command. He had a powerful air force. He had naval support. And he had something even more valuable, a proven track record of success. He'd won every major campaign he'd fought. He'd pushed the Japanese back over 1,000 miles. He'd done it with relatively low casualties compared to other Pacific operations. And at the center of all this success was planning. Detailed, careful, intelligence-driven planning. MacArthur never launched an operation without knowing as much as possible about the enemy. He studied, he analyzed, he calculated, and then he acted decisively. Climax/key moment. The ultimate test of MacArthur's planning came in October 1944. He was finally ready to fulfill his promise. He was going back to the Philippines. The intelligence picture for the Philippines operation was complex. The Japanese had heavily reinforced the islands. They knew MacArthur was coming. They'd been preparing defenses for months. The Philippines were going to be the big battle, the decisive confrontation. Japanese commanders had over 250,000 troops in the Philippines. They had fortifications. They had supplies stockpiled. They were ready for a long fight. And they had a plan to destroy the American invasion fleet with a massive naval counterattack. But MacArthur's codebreakers knew about this plan. They'd intercepted Japanese naval communications. They knew the Japanese fleet was preparing for a decisive battle. They knew the general outline of Japanese strategy. This information was passed to Admiral William Halsey, who commanded the U.S. Third Fleet supporting MacArthur's invasion. The stage was set for what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. MacArthur's invasion force landed on Leyte Island in the Philippines on October 20, 1944. MacArthur personally waded ashore with the first waves, creating one of the most famous photographs of the war. He was keeping his promise. He had returned. The landings were successful. American troops secured beachheads and pushed inland. But the Japanese weren't going to let the Philippines go without a fight. They threw everything they had at the American forces. The Japanese Navy launched their counterattack. Multiple fleet groups converged on Leyte Gulf from different directions. It was the last great gamble of the Japanese Navy. If they could destroy the American invasion fleet, they could cut off MacArthur's forces and potentially defeat the invasion. But because the Americans had intelligence about Japanese plans, they were ready. The Battle of Leyte Gulf raged for 4 days in late October 1944. American carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fought desperate actions against Japanese forces. There were moments where it looked like the Japanese might break through. At the battle off Samar, a small American escort carrier group found itself facing Japanese battleships and cruisers. The Americans fought with incredible bravery, and they managed to drive off the Japanese attack through sheer determination and aggressive tactics. When the Battle of Leyte Gulf ended, the Japanese had lost. They'd lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a catastrophic defeat. The Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. And it happened in part because American intelligence had given warning of Japanese intentions. The Americans weren't surprised. They were positioned. They were ready. MacArthur's invasion fleet survived because the Navy had intelligence about Japanese plans. On Leyte itself, the ground fighting was intense. The Japanese fought for every hill, every town, every foot of ground. It took months to clear Leyte of Japanese forces. The casualties were heavy on both sides. But MacArthur's planning paid off again. He used intelligence to identify Japanese strong points and weak points. He maneuvered his forces to avoid costly frontal attacks when possible. He used his superior firepower and air support to wear down Japanese defenders. By December 1944, Leyte was secured. MacArthur had established a major base in the Philippines. The road to Japan itself was open. The war would continue for another 8 months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan had lost. MacArthur would go on to liberate the rest of the Philippines in early 1945. He'd planned the invasion of Japan itself, though that invasion was never launched because the atomic bombs ended the war. And after Japan surrendered, MacArthur would serve as supreme commander of the Allied occupation, basically running Japan for 6 years. But the foundation of all of MacArthur's success in the Pacific was laid in those campaigns in 1942 through 1944. The campaigns where intelligence-driven planning allowed a smaller American force to defeat a larger Japanese force. The campaigns where MacArthur proved that knowing your enemy's plans was more valuable than having more troops or better equipment. Conclusion/summary. What MacArthur accomplished in the Pacific War stands as one of the great examples of how planning and intelligence can overcome numerical disadvantage. In 1942, MacArthur had almost nothing: a handful of troops, limited equipment, no naval support. He was facing the most powerful military force in Asia. Everyone expected him to lose, to just slow down the Japanese advance while waiting for reinforcements from America. Instead, MacArthur went on the offensive. He used intelligence as his primary weapon. He built his entire strategy around knowing what the Japanese were doing before they did it. Every operation was planned based on detailed intelligence about enemy positions, strength, and intentions. This wasn't luck. This was an accident. This was methodical, careful planning. MacArthur studied intelligence reports religiously. He demanded constant updates. He adjusted his plans based on new information. He was flexible, but always working toward clear objectives. MacArthur also understood the bigger picture. He developed the leapfrogging strategy that saved thousands of American lives. Instead of attacking every Japanese base, he bypassed the strong ones and attacked the weak ones. He cut Japanese supply lines. He isolated Japanese garrisons. He fought smart instead of fighting hard. And critically, MacArthur had the moral courage to act on intelligence even when it meant taking risks. The Admiralty Islands operation was risky. The Philippines invasion was risky. But MacArthur trusted his intelligence. He believed in his planning. And he was willing to take calculated risks when the intelligence supported it. Now, we need to be honest about MacArthur. He was not an easy man to like. He was arrogant. He was vain. He took credit for victories that other people deserved credit for. He was difficult to work with. He had a massive ego. After the war, he'd clash with President Truman over the Korean War and eventually be fired for insubordination. But none of that changes what he accomplished in the Pacific. He took a desperate situation and turned it into victory. He pushed back the Japanese from their furthest advance all the way back to Japan itself. He did it in 3 years with limited resources. And he did it by planning better than his opponents. The Japanese generals fighting MacArthur were not incompetent. They were experienced, capable officers. But they were fighting blind. They didn't know that their codes were broken. They didn't know that Americans were reading their plans. They made decisions based on incomplete information. MacArthur, on the other hand, had nearly complete information. He knew Japanese positions. He knew Japanese strength. He often knew Japanese intentions. This gave him an enormous advantage. And he used that advantage ruthlessly. The codebreakers who made this possible deserve enormous credit. These were teams of linguists, mathematicians, and analysts who worked in secret for the entire war. They broke codes. They translated messages. They analyzed intelligence. They worked long hours under stress. And they were never allowed to talk about what they did even after the war ended. Their work saved thousands of American lives. It shortened the war. It enabled victories that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. And MacArthur understood their value. He protected the code-breaking operations. He made sure they got resources. He used their intelligence effectively. The combination of MacArthur's strategic planning and the codebreakers' intelligence created a system that the Japanese couldn't beat. Every time Japanese commanders made a plan, the Americans knew about it. Every time Japanese forces moved, the Americans tracked them. Every time the Japanese tried to reinforce a position, the Americans were waiting. It was like playing chess against someone who can see all your pieces while you can only see some of theirs. You might be a good chess player, but you're going to lose. That's what happened to Japan in the Pacific. They were fighting a war where their opponent knew their plans. They were making moves that MacArthur had already planned counters for. They were walking into traps over and over. And the tragedy for Japan was that they never fully realized what was happening. They knew something was wrong. They knew American forces seemed to have uncanny luck. But they never understood that their codes were compromised. They kept using the same communication systems. They kept sending messages that American codebreakers could read. If Japan had realized their codes were broken and changed to unbreakable systems, the Pacific War would have been much longer and bloodier. MacArthur would have lost his intelligence advantage. He'd have had to fight blind like the Japanese were fighting. American casualties would have been much higher. But Japan didn't realize it. And MacArthur exploited that failure mercilessly. He planned operation after operation based on intelligence. He won battle after battle. He pushed forward month after month. And by the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, MacArthur had liberated the entire Southwest Pacific. The lesson from MacArthur's campaigns is clear. Intelligence matters. Planning matters. Knowing your enemy's capabilities and intentions is more valuable than having more troops or better weapons. The general who plans based on good intelligence will beat the general who relies only on courage and aggression. MacArthur proved this over and over. He showed that wars are won by minds as much as by muscles. That thinking ahead beats reacting in the moment. That patience and careful planning produce better results than rushing into battle. The general who everyone thought would lose became the general who never lost a major campaign. The commander who started with nothing built an army that conquered half the Pacific. The man who had to abandon the Philippines in defeat returned in triumph. And it all came down to planning. Detailed, careful, intelligence-driven planning. That's what turned Douglas MacArthur from a defeated commander fleeing the Philippines in 1942 into the conquering hero who accepted Japan's surrender in 1945. That's the power of planning. That's what happens when intelligence meets strategy. That's what a genius general who plans well can accomplish against impossible odds. Watch the next video to see another general's incredible story.